Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. And if anybody comes in,
Yeah.
they can just join us.
Yeah, this is an easy seat for someone to sit in, so I'll go.
Well, I didn't realize it was going to be noisy. Today's topic, of course, is evil and the cross of Christ. Now, according to the Gospel of John, the arrest and trial of Jesus of Nazareth was a very confused and disorderly affair. Judas entered into the garden at the head of a strangely mixed posse of Roman soldiers, temple police, and zealous Pharisees. They confronted Jesus, who told them plainly who he was, and then they drew back out of abject fear or sheer stupidity, and they fell to the ground. The question and answer were repeated, and then Jesus surrendered himself in order to save the lives of those whom God had placed in his charge. It is difficult to decipher whether Peter's violent reaction was based on anger, fear for his master, or anxiety over being left out or left alone. In any event, Peter lashed out, cutting off the ear of the high priest's servant. Jesus rebuked his erstwhile defender, and the ragtag posse, now realizing that there would be no resistance, hastily bound up the Galilean prophet and led him away. They then took their prisoner before a dizzying array of authorities, first to Annas, then to Caiaphas, and finally to Pilate and the crowds. The trials were haphazard and equally confusing affairs that defy all known patterns of Jewish or Roman jurisprudence. Decisions were hastily and abruptly made, and perimeters of jurisdiction and authority were quickly drawn and readily dispensed with. Jesus was shuffled from one seat of judgment to another, followed by Peter, who in the throes of his own fear and confusion denied his beloved master 3 times. All in all, it is a drama of bewilderment and betrayal, a haunting tale of individual and corporate confusion, where men acted instinctively out of fear and disorientation. Now, the church has traditionally interpreted this story as a sign of unprecedented evil. And through the long ages, Christians have sought to trace that evil back to its source. Many have maintained that Jesus was put to death by evil men, Pilate, Caiaphas, and Judas. Yet the more one looks into the actual situation, and the more one comes to know the beating of one's own heart, the harder it is to judge these individuals as the source of all that is evil in this very sordid tale. Pilate, after all, was a Roman governor, committed to maintaining a fragile peace in a territory that was renowned for its political instability. His actions speak of a frustrated and frantic bureaucrat, simply struggling to maintain a highly tenuous status quo. Caiaphas the high priest, assuming you get that, there it is. Caiaphas the high priest was bound to uphold the law and to act in its defense. He was presented with a man who blasphemed, who claimed to be, in some strange sense, divine, the Son of the living God. Like Pilate, he saw Jesus as a threat to order and stability, and given such fears, he reacted rather predictably. The case of Judas is, of course, more complex. His motives are not easily explained, since he had no political or ideological allegiances except to the man he betrayed. His dilemma seems to have been strangely akin to Blessed St. Peter's. and that he felt that Jesus was not living into the messianic role that he had fervently hoped for. He thought that Jesus was betraying the ideals and the goals of the messianic movement. And he despaired at the sight of his shattered dreams. The more I look at Judas, and the more I come to know the dark workings of my own heart, I find it difficult to regard him as an evil monster. His confusion, his shame, his suicide, they speak of a man driven by internal conflicts that were more human than demonic. But if these confused and frightened men were not the source of the evil, where exactly was it? The Lord of heaven was crucified, nailed to an obscene instrument of human torture. Certainly something or someone was to blame. If the evil was not Pilate's, nor Caiaphas's, nor Judas's, then perhaps it was the crowd. The mob that chose Barabbas and called for the crucifixion of the man who claimed to be the Christ. Surely, however, their reaction is completely understandable. They hailed a Messiah on Palm Sunday, a Savior, and now they saw this man upon whom they had showered their cheers and their hosannas standing before them as a prisoner, bloodied, beaten, mocked, disgraced. They undoubtedly believed that they had been duped, falling prey to the hoax of a charlatan, and they now shouted in self-righteous anger for expedient justice. Where then lies the evil? Who crucified my Lord? The answer to that question lies hidden within the name of the day, that day we dare to call Good Friday. It is good. It is good because on this day, our frail notion of good and evil, right and wrong, peace and justice were forever crucified. Jesus was not sentenced to death by evil men, but simply by men. Frightened men, confused men, who made choices based on their perception of reality and their misguided belief in what they thought was best for their communities. They were men who chose the least imperfect good they could see, the lesser evil. And in doing so, they crucified goodness himself. And so we too often discover that our most earnest attempts at being good end in apparent evil. Now, to realize that such was and is the case enables us to see the real goodness of that day. It allows us to see that in his arrest and trial and crucifixion, Christ was not the victim of evil machinations. It was, once again, acting out the drama of the incarnation, accepting our broken humanity. This was the world he maintained in creation. These were the men and women he had come to save. This was the law he had come to fulfill. In his arrest and trial, no less than on the hard wood of the cross, Jesus chooses us. He chooses life. Not some pristine, abstract form of existence, but our life, this life, in all its ambiguity, in all its cruelty, in all its confusion and terrifying fragility, in all its suffering, in all its decay. Those choices that Jesus made before Judas, before Pilate, before Caiaphas, and before that disillusioned crowd they transformed a seedy tale of betrayal, injustice, and fear into the very record of our salvation. With those choices, Jesus forever altered the heart of life, the center of our reality. He made us new creatures, the object and subject of graceful mercy. We live in a world that often appears as obscene as the cross, filled with pain, confusion, fear, betrayal, injustice, and yes, evil. Yet through the events of Good Friday, we now know that Jesus entered into that obscenity. He accepted it as part of the humanity he had come to redeem, and in doing so, he gave us the redemptive choice of salvation. Now, as you might suspect, in preparing for this series of talks, I did a great deal of reading in a variety of sources: history, philosophy, theology. One of the books that I found both challenging and helpful was entitled The Cambridge Companion to the Problem of Evil, which contained a whole collection of essays on the topic of evil written by philosophers and theologians, Christians, atheists, theists, and Jewish and Islamic scholars. In all honesty, some of the essays were so intricate and convoluted in their reasoning and logic that I found myself like Dante lost in a dark wood. But several were not only understandable, but were extremely thought-provoking. A number of those essays deal with the issue of suffering. For centuries, as we've seen, philosophers and theologians have struggled with the idea of a benevolent and omnipotent God whose creation is replete with suffering. What if, some thinkers have proposed, that the act of creation could not occur without engaging suffering? Robert J. Russell has argued that the basic structure of the physical universe, as God has created it, is an arena of creaturely possibilities and creaturely suffering. One linchpin in this argument is what is known, I'm sure many of you are aware, the second law of thermodynamics. That law states that the overall degree of disorder in a physical system will always tend to increase. In other words, all physical systems are in the process of decay. From the arc of atoms and the course of planets to the biological realities of aging. Such decay inevitably causes suffering. A number of scholars writing in this area suggest that certain natural laws, like the second law, like plate tectonics, or natural selection, are necessary elements in divine creation, and that God could not have created this sort of world or reality without engaging the dynamic of suffering. As one author summarizes, the whole essence of the picture as it has emerged since the 19th century is that it is the same processes, tectonics, creaturely decay, mutation, natural selection, to name only a few, that generate the suffering, as also generate the beauty, ingenuity, and diversity of the world of creatures. On an important level, through the astonishing act of the incarnation, God made God's self part of that physical reality of decay and death. But of course, the second law may help us to understand the physical suffering inherent in the created order, natural evil. But it does not explain or excuse the moral suffering that is perpetuated by men and women on their fellow creatures, their animals, and sadly, their planet. Here we have to come back and kneel before the cross of Christ. In his arrest and trial and crucifixion, Jesus not only embraces the fearful dynamics of natural evil, but also the moral evil perpetuated by human beings who judge with callous impunity and rule through oppression, insensitivity, and cruel violence. On the Friday we dare to call good. God in Christ accepts into his being the nails of human scorn and hatred, the human capacity to inflict others with suffering and death, the human inability to experience and express empathy and forgiveness. In other words, Jesus embraces us, all of us, the dark side as well as the light, the moral imperfections and flaws, as well as the ability to extend our hearts in love. On the cross, and in all the dark events that preceded, Jesus chooses us, all of us. He chose us so that we might choose him. He suffered pain so that in the midst of our pain, we might choose him. He entered into a nightmare of oppression and injustice so that when we are confronted with similar moments of dejection and despair, we might choose him. He stood silent before the mockery of men so that in the midst of such derision, we might choose him. He stood silent before the mockery. He was buffeted and brutalized in the mindless fear of confused men, so that in the midst of things that we cannot fathom or understand, we might choose him. He died a painful and ignominious death, so that in the midst of our death, we might choose him. He exposed himself to the heartbreaking sin of the cross, so that we, weighed down with our own sinfulness, might repent and choose him. He chose to experience the blank power of moral evil, so that when we are confronted with such evil, we might choose him. He has chosen you, wedded himself to your very nature, through the iron and the wood of the cross. And he did so in order to offer you the means of choosing him. The cross proclaims that there is nothing to be experienced in this life that he has not chosen, that he has not made the potential vehicle of redemptive grace. There is no evil, natural or moral, that cannot be borne and ultimately vanquished through faith in his grace-filled choices. Now that grace does not change reality. It does not make the pain go away, obliterate the ugliness, doesn't do away with evil or banish obscenity. But it does make such events bearable by stamping them with the mark of his redemptive love. In his death, Jesus invites us to live. to choose life, no matter what the cost, to choose reality, no matter how uncomfortable or painful. For it is within such life and within such reality that he offers himself to us. In the second letter to the church in Corinth, Paul presents a detailed list of his suffering. In affliction, in necessities, in distress, in floggings, in imprisonments, in riots, in hard labor, in sleepless nights, in going without food, as dying and yet we live, as beaten and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as having nothing and yet possessing everything. Paul's point is not that his faith was a magical talisman that rescued him from suffering and evil, but rather that through and in the very midst of that suffering, he was made aware of the redemptive power of Christ's eternal love. To choose Jesus in faith is to experience salvation. It is to know that nothing in life, nothing in death can separate us from the love and mercy of God in Christ, if only we choose it in faith. It is to know that no force on earth, not even those of evil and sin, can prevent us from laying claim to the grace of Almighty God. It is to know that all the crosses of our life shine with redemptive love. It is to know that by his wounds we have been healed. It is to accept an unconditional love that will bind us to God through the course of eternity. To choose Jesus is to find within our nature the perfection of his, wrought for all time upon the wood of the cross of Calvary. The 12th century theologian, one of my favorites, Peter Abelard, believed that the love of God revealed in and through the cross of Christ had the power to create a love that was lacking in the human heart, and thereby to inspire and create human transformation. Abelard wrote, God's Son has taken upon himself our nature and preserved therein in teaching us by word and example, even unto death. He has more fully bound us to himself by love, with the result that our hearts should be enkindled by such a gift of divine grace. Such love, he goes on to argue, is what truly frees us from the power of evil and the bonds of sin. Whether you choose to believe that evil is simply the absence of good, as St. Augustine, the machinations of demonic forces, the painful result of a lack of empathy, the power of the collective unconsciousness, or simply the product of selfish, self-serving choices, I do know for certain that we will all experience moments when we are the victims or perpetrator of evil. Such knowledge, such foreknowledge, would be difficult to bear were it not for that Friday that we dare to call good, when through the power of the incarnate love of God, God wedded God's self to all our reality, empowering us to overcome evil with the reality of divinely inspired love. That's all I've got to say. And now we can open it up to your questions, comments, concerns, and corrections. Yes.
So, do you personally believe there is a devil?
You know, we sort of talked about that in a couple of these things, or we've implied it. When we ask that question, you know, obviously the operative term is, what do we mean when we say devil? Do we mean a force that is against God, outside of God's control? Do we mean some sort of demonic power that is independent of human existence and is constantly tempting people to go the wrong way, to commit sin, to commit evil acts? No, I don't believe that. I do, you know, it's funny, when I first converted to Christianity, I was old, and some say I was 22. I've been an atheist, or a proselytizing atheist. I used to, when I was in college at the great University of the South, our shared alma mater, I used to give people copies of Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian for their birthdays. But then I had my conversion experience, and I began to grapple with trying to figure out what this faith meant for me and how I would integrate it into my life and my understanding of how life and how life worked. And at first, I was totally with St. Augustine of Hippo, you know, and as we saw a few weeks ago, you know, Hippo basically said, evil is simply the absence of good, just like, you know, black is the absence of white. And so that's what, you know, evil didn't really have a nature or force of its own. It was simply when there was an absence of good. And at first that made perfect sense to me. I mean, it does make logical sense. And I said, okay, that's it. Solve the problem of evil. I can move on to the next thing. Well, then I began to live my life as a Christian. And I began to look at the world through the eyes of a Christian's viewpoint. And I began to think that, no, that's too passive. Evil has a force. Evil is not simply the absence of good. Evil is something that can be powerful and alive in our worlds and our hearts. And so now you come back to your question. What causes that? I think that one of the things that I have learned and am willing to commit my intellect to is that when human beings make corporate decisions, when they begin to wed their wills together, what they create is something that has its own life, its own experience, and its own destructive power. So that, for example, when you look at that phenomenon, you know, all thoughts about evil, I mean, there's a wonderful book by a Princeton theologian, a woman, that basically traces the history of the idea of evil from the 18th century to the present day. And she begins her analysis, as we talked about it on the first session, with the earthquake in Lisbon in 1755, which was a catastrophic affair and hit the minds of the Enlightenment, sort of blew them right out of the water because they had to force, you know, a new understanding of what was evil. And she said that's what started it, and she traces the enlightened thinkers and their successors all through the centuries. But of course, where does she end? Auschwitz. Because Auschwitz redefines our whole understanding of evil. It breaks down all the thought that went before. It is beyond human imagination. How do you account for it? Well, you know, here you have a demonic power that was let loose by the deranged thinking of a madman. And yet it spoke somehow to people. It spoke to them, and they began to invest their thoughts, their feelings, their faith in this vision of Hitler's. And as they did that, it took on more and more power. And the power wasn't dependent just on the individual choices. It began to develop a corporate power. I don't think, one of the most frightening things that you can consider is, the man who was putting the switch on the gas chambers. He was probably going home to his family, sitting down at the dinner table. Did he, feel burdened with guilt? Probably not.
Well, he knew if he didn't flip the switch, he'd be in there.
Well, it may have been self-preservation, but he might just say, this is what we need to do, because I believe now, and I have been totally convinced that Jews need to be eradicated, because they are a plague on humankind. And when you have things like that, then I think, the power of the demonic becomes something which needs to be combated with an equally potent corporate response. In World War II, we saw it. The free world rose up on its hind legs and embraced a goodness that was based on defeating and annihilating that evil. And I think that happens on many other levels in our society. We spent one session, as many of you know, on racism and sexism and war. And I think in all those areas, we see both dynamics at play.
Ted, who was the theologian? I'm just curious that you are talking about from Princeton. What's her name?
Susan Neiman.
Thank you.
I've got her. I can get you a reference.
And I just got down here because of the flood a few weeks ago, so I didn't make all of your lectures. But, my view, quite a while in thinking about this problem of Hitler, if you will, of evil, has been that somehow men just have within them, almost as they were created, an evil streak as well. Not just capability, but something that can spring up and needs to be consciously addressed and resisted, which it's not in much of our culture, at least on the trivial levels of it. And you've probably addressed it, but because I then say, well, if we were created in God's image and God created us, would he really create creatures that have this evil in them?
It's a very good question. I mean, again, one of the things that I hope people realize as we went through these talks is what an incredible impact St. Augustine of Hippo had on all sorts of thinking, but particularly you can trace, John Calvin right into Augustine's camp. So a lot of what we call Calvinism, is rooted in the writings and the perception of Augustine of Hippo. And Augustine of Hippo articulated what I think you're describing, which is he talked about original sin. And he believed that, with Adam and Eve, you had the initial choice that was inherently sinful, and that forever changed the DNA of human beings. That human beings inherited from the decision and disobedience of Adam and Eve, this defective gene, so to speak. And that, it was passed on from generation to generation. So according to Augustine, according to Calvin, and Calvin's atonement theory is based on this, but we won't go into that. But according to their way of thinking, human beings at the very start have this inherent evil. And it's there, and you can't really do anything about it except to rely on grace to take care of it eventually. I don't buy it. I think that, for me, the dilemma you're describing is simply a product of free will. That I think, the ultimate gift that God gave humankind was the ability to make choices, moral choices as well as ordinary choices. And that we get it wrong. And we make mistakes. I don't think we're necessarily programmed to do that. I think we just do it for a variety of reasons. And yes, can we be incredibly selfish? Can we be insensitive to the needs of others? There's a lot of things that we don't regard as evil, which I think show that we make very bad choices. And we make them relatively consistently. But I don't think it's a matter of some kind of inherent flaw that's in our nature.
Well, I can buy that when you come to lust and some of the things that maybe I even did in my 20s. But this whole thing of the camps and Hitler and killing 6 million people intentionally, that goes beyond kind of self-centeredness, if you will.
Yeah, it does, but I mean, it's that kind, maybe the brutality of that in the modern era, was incredibly, well, what I'm trying to say is that what happened in Auschwitz, as horrific as it is because of numbers, is something that we can find consistently displayed in human nature, all the way back. We can see that power, political power, military power, has been abused and used to murder and kill, millions of people. Just before, the word that we applied to went on in Auschwitz is genocide. Well, when was that term first used? Well, it was first written by a Polish reporter to describe what was going on in Armenia.
Oh, interesting.
And the Ottoman Empire, so. Yes, right.
But even before that, there've been genocides going way
Oh,
back.
Yeah.
But the gospel writers seem to create the image of the very force of evil as Jesus was tempted. The discussion of the devil, so-called. They really created that image that has come down through the ages.
Yeah, well, as we talked about that before, I think that the image of the demonic, you don't really find it as perceived in the Old Testament. As we talked about, the demonic force that you can't even call it demonic, that deals with Job, is actually a minion of God. God gives Satan, which simply translated means the adversary, God gives Satan control over Job.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that, it's really the temptation in the wilderness that we see the first time that there's a satanic presence which seems to be outside of the control of God, but maybe not. Many people have argued that Jesus was hurled into the wilderness. As I said when I talked about this, it's literally like a javelin is hurled. The Greek word is thrown into the wilderness. Well, who was throwing it? It was God. God apparently wanted Jesus to go into the wilderness and confront those temptations. And the decisions that Jesus makes are, of course, the ones that Adam and Eve didn't.
And yet we say Jesus is God.
What?
And yet we say Jesus is God.
Yeah. Well, I think that by making those decisions, and it's Jesus.
He's just wrestling with his own,
Yeah.
it's his own head. He's wrestling with, I'm God. I am the Son of God. I am the chosen one, but I'm also human. And am I going to use my position or my abilities as the Son of God to do, to take over the world or to do this or to do that? I think he's just wrestling
Well, no,
internally with
Every temptation he is given, all three of them, are basically trying to get him to deny his humanity.
Yep.
And he refuses to do that. And so he makes the very decisions. The devil's trying to get him to eat from the tree of knowledge, from good and evil, and he refuses to do it. He will do nothing to compromise the integrity of his humanity. There are, of course, lots of pieces of the New Testament are scenes in which we encounter demonic forces. And Jesus, of course, addresses them and exercises them. And that over the course of the centuries, after the New Testament period, especially into the fourth and the fifth and the sixth centuries, as the church becomes more, you cannot underestimate the impact of the year 312. Okay, the Constantinian triumph, the moment that the church became the primary religious cult of the Roman Empire of Constantine. It forever, the church went in a very short period from being basically a mom and pop store in the incredible diversity of religious cults in the Mediterranean to being Walmart.
Yeah, exactly.
And it happened like that. And everything changed. The way that churches were built, the hierarchy of the church, theology changed. It was incredible. And one of the things that they had to deal with was that there was especially when Constantine made it, he made it fairly clear that if you wanted to go forward in the imperial bureaucracy, you had to be a Christian, right? So now all of a sudden, you're getting Christians that sort of look like they appeared in ads in the New Yorker, and they're converting to this faith, and these are sophisticated people, and they've got some pretty sophisticated philosophical understandings of how the world works, how theology works, how belief works, and so the church all of a sudden has to start reframing its message in order to address and to respond to this new class of Christians and their education and their experience. And so the church begins to, on all levels, it begins to rethink, who Jesus is, how you explain Jesus, and they get into some very, very interesting but confusing debates. For example, this morning, for those of you who went to church, you said something that we call the Nicene Creed. Okay? Well, the Nicene Creed was designed so that an Arian couldn't say it. There was a guy, a heretic, named Arius, and he was incredibly influential. And he basically argued that there were several things about Jesus that the church was getting wrong. One of the things that he said they were getting wrong is the fact that they seemed to suggest that Jesus was always there with God, that Jesus was eternal as God was. And then there was the question of, was Jesus, the Greek word is, when you make a pot, the Greek word is poao, okay? It's creating, making a pot. If you beget somebody, that is a different verb altogether, it's genitas. And so Arius argued that Jesus was poeo, that Jesus was made. And he argued there was a time when Jesus was not. God created. Well, think about the Nicene Creed. Begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made. Basically, the creed, the Nicene Creed, was designed intentionally so that an Arian couldn't say it. All right? So that's, those are the kinds of issues that began to emerge as the church began to deal with this new popularity, this new extension of both its theology and its control and everything else. And it did forever change, how they addressed so many of these issues when it came to who Jesus was. Well, the point I was trying to make, I've gone way off it, is that it's also during the same period from the 4th century on when they begin to address the whole understanding of the demonic. And it's when they begin to really develop a history, so to speak, of Satan. And they go read Revelation again, and they say, well, this tells us, who Satan was, how Satan, and the whole understanding of Lucifer comes up in this thing. And so you begin to get this creation of a story about this evil power that is in an adversarial struggle with God. Now, they never really doubt the fact that God's going to win in the end, and that God can take some of the evil that is being done by this demonic head and turn it on its head and make it a good rather than evil. But you begin to develop this really bifurcated world where there is, the world of the demonic and the world of God. And people, of course, develop, especially all the way through the Middle Ages, they begin to develop ways in which they seek to put themselves on the side, to combat the demonic through all sorts of means and to assert their faith. And then when we get to the 18th century, that's when you begin to have this new understanding of what we've talked about, natural evil versus moral evil. Because they begin to struggle. This was when I was referring to the earthquake of 1755 in Lisbon. Before that, when you go back to the Middle Ages and even during the Reformation, when you had a natural catastrophe, you tended to try to explain it theologically as, these people did something to deserve that. Well, Lisbon just blew that out of the water. They didn't know how to deal with this incredible, how do you explain this? How does God allow this to happen?
Like the Old Testament God.
Yeah, so they begin to create a new understanding where there's natural evil, which is just the product of natural forces like earthquakes and things of that sort. And there's moral evil. Moral evil is the product of human choices. Now, interestingly enough, I'll say this and I'll get back to your questions, but the woman, Neiman, who wrote this history, this is sort of the work on the history of evil that everybody refers to. And it's been published, republished 3 times. In the last, she's written a preface to both the 2006 edition and the 2015, I think it was, edition. In the 2015 edition, she, of course, had talked about the difference between natural evil and moral evil. And she points out in the 2015 edition that for the first time, those two things have been combined. Because we can no longer say that the things that we call natural evil, like storms, like
Hurricanes.
are caused just by nature. They're caused by moral decisions which human beings have made that are ultimately destroying the planet. So the distinction between natural evil and moral evil now seems to be coming back together.
Why, the animal kingdom operates with animals doing instinctively, they kill other animals primarily to eat. There does not seem to be any moral evil that I'm aware of in the animal kingdom, unless maybe whales and elephants or something do something because they have, a little more brain. But why are we capable of moral evil? Why don't we operate like every other, creation of God? Why would he make us capable of?
Because he's given us free will, and maybe in a way that animals don't. I mean, the big question about animals, it's a fascinating question, and poor Alex here suffered from we're part of a little group that kicks around ideas, and when I was in charge of creating the idea we were going to kick around, I chose consciousness because I think it's such an important topic that is now getting the kind of philosophical, theological attention it deserves. And one of the big questions, though, is, are animals conscious?
Some animals
Well, it's,
seem to be, and
yeah, no,
at least then maybe more than we know. I mean, even plants communicate with each other.
trees.
So,
But if they are conscious, then all of a sudden you're into a moral area.
but you don't see them conniving. You don't see them creating corporate.
Well, we don't really know that.
Chimpanzees.
Yeah.
Not the forest.
Well, there are the 7 deadly sins. I mean, things like, greed and
When you say
there's a whole
conscious, do you
different
mean
idea.
self-aware?
That's part of it. Yeah, it's the ability to, consciousness is our ability to be self-referential, to understand ourselves, both in the context of our immediate and greater environment, and in context with each other. And I watched last night the wonderful story, The Book of Joy, which if you haven't,
the Dalai
it's-
Lama.
they've made a movie out of it.
Oh, is there?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's Desmond Tutu talking to
to
the
the
Dalai
Dalai
Lama.
Lama.
It's called
And
Mission
it is
Joy.
a thing of beauty to see the two of them, how they love each other and how they've come to know each other. Very different traditions. And it's possible, you see, it's possible, we don't have to be competitive or,
Well, and he, in the course of this conversation, Desmond Tutu brings up the concept of Ubuntu, which is an African concept, which is really, in some ways, a statement of consciousness, because it is, the understanding is, you and I only exist because of our relationship.
Mm.
Without me, you don't really exist. Without, there's this way that we relate to one another, and it's the basis for this incredible morality that Desmond Tutu has, and which permeates a lot of African understanding, this nature that we depend on one another. Not only for, caring for each other, but
For very
consciousness.
existence.
Yeah. I've gone way on here.
Well, very-
Well,
I'm enjoying it.
I'm glad I didn't have my number crossed today.
Was it a good mistake?
Yes. Thank you.
Me too.
And I love
Thank you
your
very
choice
much,
of,
Dad.
artwork too, very beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
One of my dearest
It's sort of fun
friends,
putting those
his
together.
name is Michael
But,
Thomas.
Yeah, that's
There's
the,
a lot of us around.
that of course is the scene of the resurrection, where Jesus is stepping on and standing on the gates of hell and is lifting Adam and Eve out of hell.
Hmm.
Redeeming them, huh?
What?
Redeeming them.
Yes,
Who is that by?
it's it's an iconographic tradition,
Oh,
so they don't really know that's
wonderful.
the anastasis. It's very funny because, again, now I'm going to tell you things that you really did want to know. But,
No. I wanna
to look at the artistic traditions of Western Christianity versus Eastern Christianity, you see some very interesting distinctions. And for example, in Western Christianity, there is a whole, as you all well know, there's a whole artistic tradition showing the resurrection, showing Jesus coming out of the tomb, you know, and it's depicted in a whole variety of ways and in different eras. In the Eastern tradition, there's not that. They don't show the resurrection. They show what we call the harrowing of hell, which is the understanding that Jesus, you know, when after Jesus' resurrection, he went down, as we say in the creed, and in doing so, he liberated all those who were you know, contained in hell. And so this is their Easter tradition. If you go into in fact, if you go out, there's a wonderful church, an Orthodox church out on Immokalee, that I took a bunch of people from Orange Park to go see. And they have a wonderful iconographic schema, and this features very significantly in theirs.
Wow.
Okay, thank you.
Good to have you teaching here again. I'm gonna miss that.
See you tomorrow night.
Hi, Marty, how are you?